Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm glad to see everyone here. It's my great pleasure to introduce Chris Gaffney. I've had the pleasure of working him for about 7 years at Coca-Cola. Great guy, very knowledgeable. We'll call him a visionary from my side. And you're going to tell basically firsthand, he's a great colleague, but genuinely a good guy. Um, He's a seasoned supply chain expert with deep experience in operations, logistics, distribution, proven track record of just basically everything that you can imagine of improving efficiency, driving results, and building strong teams in complex environments. Uh, Please welcome me and giving a warm welcome to Chris.
Thank you, Michael, and I appreciate the chance to chat with everybody today. I'm going to give you a headline on the topic, and then I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then we'll kind of dive in. And I would encourage you to stop me at any time if you have a question or comment, so we don't need to wait till the end. So the topic is leading through supply chain disruption with a lens, that it's a focus on if you're a finance business partner, what's your role in this in supporting your supply chain teams? And I don't have to tell you as a consumer or anybody dealing in any physical goods business, the volatility that we've seen over the last 5 to 7 years is just a steady stream. It's not periodic anymore. And we've had the diversity of disruptions that everybody are dealing with. And if you're on the finance side, you live this just about as much as your supply chain colleagues do, because you're constantly having to understand the impact on the in-year plan, and then ultimately as balance sheet decisions are made on inventory and or capex, for capacity and other things, the finance folks are at the table for that. So that's kind of the framing that I'll use for today. So a little bit about me. As Michael mentioned, he and I worked together at Coca-Cola. I'm one of those people who did not travel the world. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I moved to Atlanta to go to school at Georgia Tech, and I've essentially lived here ever since. And so that's my world. I'm an East Coast person who came south to go to a warmer school, and that was about as sophisticated as my decision making was in those days. But I was very fortunate to come to Georgia Tech. I studied industrial and systems engineering, which is a fancy way of saying how do processes and systems work well. I've been around long enough where the concept of supply chain was not even a thing when I came to school. But when I went into industry and I went to work at Frito-Lay out of school, they said you can choose logistics or manufacturing. And I really went into logistics. So that's kind of where I cut my teeth at Frito-Lay. Tremendous amount of responsibility for somebody right out of school, but a great hands-on experience. I worked in warehouses and I worked in plants as a supervisor and a manager and that type of thing. And I dearly love, working in an operating environment at that point in my career. And after I worked at Frito-Lay, I went to work for AJC International. And AJC is essentially a trading company that specializes predominantly in protein. And when I joined their team, it was in an international logistics leadership role. So at the time I left Frito, I said, I think I'm going to stick with this logistics stuff. I had done, domestic private fleet with Frito-Lay. And I said, now let me see if I can learn this international stuff. So I started to understand ocean, rail, temperature control, a bit of air, and all the dynamics of understanding how to move things around the world, which was great. And after a number of years there, I got a call from, ironically, my prior boss at Frito-Lay said, hey, a pretty cool job at Coca-Cola. And so that's how I got to Coke. And I spent 25 years at Coke. The first portion of that was all in logistics and distribution. And as ultimately I was able to rise up in the organization, I got involved in supply chain planning and supply chain strategy and infrastructure optimization. Like where should Coke have its plants in the US be, or where should they all be? Do we need new ones? Do we need to close them? How do we source our distribution centers based on those plants? So back to actually using a lot of the analytics and optimization that I learned in school and practice. And then finally, some work in supply chain strategy. And I will say, A lot of my framing for you today is working with really, really well-rounded, thoughtful finance business partners at Coke, such as tremendous role models. And a lot of what I saw in working well, you'll hear about today. Um, I retired from Coke about 5 years ago. I've done a bunch of consulting, and I actually came back to Georgia Tech a couple of years ago, and I'm working in a supply chain and logistics research institute now. Um, I do a tremendous amount of mentoring and coaching. I have a leadership podcast series we've done 20 episodes of. I very much am a give back person because early in my career, in both college and my working career, people helped me for no good reason, just out of the goodness of their heart. And I can't repay those folks, but I can repay others. Um, I was fortunate to meet my wife, in the latter years of my undergrad. She got me to stop studying 40 hours a week and try to live a balanced student life, which was great. We've now been married for 38 years. We have 4 adult children, 4 partners, and 3 grandkids. The couple in the center, that picture needs to be updated because they've not got a little baby. Um, and then outside of work, I love to run. I'm no good at it, but I've been running for over 30 years and I've run 20 marathons, none of them very fast. And then we have one child who had leukemia, and so we do a lot of work raising money for childhood cancer research. So that's more than a minute, but a little about me. Okay. So now kind of let's dive into this topic of disruption. And I've watched this topic, since my early days in the field. And, I always want to think about this as, a little bit of a discussion about insurance, because most people don't want to, as their first inclination, invest in things that will impact or mitigate the cost of disruption. But after the fact, they're really concerned about why things have cost so much because of a disruption. So there's still a challenge in the C-suite in terms of people really thinking about supply chain as a cost center. And people like, why do we want to invest in time and understanding risk and mitigating risk and maybe spending more money early on to potentially reduce the impact when something bad happens? We also know that there's a lot of cost. If people are very focused on just getting the best supplier they can find in their mind, which usually means low cost, but if they fragment that supplier network, there's a cost in that over time. So I think that's a data point for me. And then the idea of tracking risk metrics is increasing, but it's still only a quarter of firms think about this in terms of their KPIs. So, this is where I want to try to make the case of why the right investment in understanding and trying to mitigate and plan and prepare for disruption is relevant for finance audience. The reality is almost everybody has some impact of a supply chain disruption. And I think even this past week, if I'm not mistaken, one of the last big car companies in Europe, maybe it was Jaguar or somebody else, their entire supply chain was down due to a cyber attack for a few days. And who knows what that's going to cost them. But this is not like lightning that hits a few people. This is something that a high percentage of businesses are impacted by some type of disruption. And when we talk about disruption, we talk about supply chain resilience. The idea is, how do you bounce back? And how do you bounce back to your prior condition? Do you get back to running your business full speed? That takes time, but in most cases, it takes longer time than people expect. So, our suggestion for small business and big businesses, this isn't a question of when it will or if it will occur. It's a function of when and how ready you are to respond. And I know some people, and a lot of people have spent more time on this, but we just want to make the case that the businesses who are best prepared, it's not luck, right? They're not just, hoping and praying. They're being thoughtful about this. It's part of their planning process. They're always thinking about how to get better. And I'm going to propose some different principles that I think are worthy of consideration in almost any business. I make a strong case, having sat close to the top in a few situations, that I always want to get buy-in in the concept of risk resilience planning from the CFO. And I've worked with some really good ones in my time at Coke. both at the higher level, for the company and at the business unit level. We want to make sure that the CFO understands the ROI for investing in supply chain resilience and thinking about that business case with a long-term perspective, not just a short-term perspective. We can get that right kind of thought process around how we invest, and think about this as part of the decision making in terms of both OpEx and CapEx. We did get, in some cases, some overreaction, in terms of post-pandemic and that type of things. That's not sustainable either. So we really got to think about this idea of a cost of resilience and a balance in terms of where do we make intentional decisions, whether that be things like dual sourcing, and how do you properly leverage contract manufacturers and that type of thing. And I've seen a lot of people, and it's been a big challenge, in particular with the rise of China as the global factory, is they're such a low cost supplier and they could consume all your volume. And I recall for a very particular commodity, there was one source outside of China, and the folks at Coke were making the case to say, we think we should have a relationship with this other supplier as a contingency. It's a significant incremental cost, but we think it's the right decision for the long term. That was a very high level decision. But ultimately, whether it was in that case, maybe 10% of their spend in that category, it took a huge premium. But guess what? When pandemic hit, they had a relationship with that supplier very quickly, with, again, very senior alignment, said, let's go to this supplier and understand any slack capacity they have and try to make a commit with them. And they were able to do that. And they were able to keep a product line in business when many other suppliers couldn't. So it really is a strategic decision for finance to be involved. And in most companies where there is structured planning, in many cases, it's about closing the books. If you don't, if you do have, robust sales and operations planning or true integrated business planning, that's great. But the financial tempo of running a business, we would really just want to try to get risk thinking into those regular planning cycles. And anything we can do there to make it repeating helps us build that muscle over time. So I think things that I feel like have worked really well, and the experience I've had, is this idea of proactive scenario planning. And I'm going to talk about some examples of how to do that. It's easy to do now. In some cases, it can be done in a very qualitative way, but there are a lot more tools and resources available to do this with some level of analytics to it, to try to understand what will happen if something goes wrong. Okay. And I will go back to a later example. What we got really good at Coke after Hurricane Katrina was understanding how we planned better for hurricane season, because it was just something as a national business, because the hurricanes come across the Gulf and come to the Atlantic, it just impacted, about a third of the US population. And so you had to have some planning around that. And the truth is, when it happened and big storms happened, it disrupted, in many cases, half the country. So thinking about that to understand what are our vulnerabilities, what could we do differently, what would it cost us to mitigate that? And I will say this is something we got really good at Coke. We brought everybody in. We had sales, we had supply chain, we had finance. We actually had a few risk folks who actually taught some of the tools very well. And we went through a number of those hurricane tabletops, and we made decisions. And in particular, Coke had a couple plants in Florida that made orange juice. And in one case, they had a plant that was a sole source plant for a very large customer. And we had a discussion internally in response to the customer concerns about single source as a supplier, and essentially agreed and did it for a number of years. I'm not sure if they still do it today, but as hurricane season occurred, there was an agreement that a certain amount of inventory, and this product was temperature controlled, so it had a longer shelf life, that product would be run ahead of demand and moved to a cold storage in Atlanta. So it was out of the market. It provided some buffer if there was an issue that were down there. But that was a big strategic decision. and finance was clearly at the table for that. So this proactive planning allows you to say, what are we going to do? We can't do everything, but what are a few things we can do that will make a difference? And ironically, if you ever drive by Coke's headquarters, which is actually near where I sit at the Georgia Tech campus, there is a truckload generator that sits at Coke that at one point in time Coke made the decision to buy. That is portable. It can go somewhere else, but that's a good example of an investment you would make to kind of protect business continuity. So this idea first of just being proactive, get everybody in the room, think through the things that could go wrong, and decide if there are a few risks that merit some advanced decisions. This is something that's newer. This idea of always on risk monitoring. When we were at Coke during the pandemic, there was an ask, I think it was from very senior people at Coke, if not the board, to understand what is going on in every market in the world in terms of impacts that may impact our ability to run operations, sell product, move things around. And in a shockingly short time, it might have been a week, but it was no more than 2 weeks, muscled together a manual process where there was reporting, if not daily, multiple times a week, that says, what is the state of affairs in each of these countries? And that has evolved over the last few years to a capability. And they found a partner who basically provides always on risk monitoring, right? There are now firms that specialize in this. There are a few who sit at the top of the list, and I have a relationship with one that I really like, Everstream Analytics. They publish a lot. If you're on LinkedIn, you can follow the folks that are there. David Shillingford is the guy I follow, and if they're not the gold star, they're pretty close in terms of the capability that they have. There are a lot of people who offer this capability. Clearly, it's at a price, depending on who you are and where you are. This capability may or may not be for you. But what I would also tell you is that there are degrees of this capability that are kind of available open source. So if you're at a smaller company, I would contend that from a generative AI standpoint, using some of the open source tools there, you can create a proxy capability of this that's not too shabby. So this is one of those things that I think is newer, but is helpful because early awareness, besides proactive planning, the next thing is time. How and when do we understand that there could be a problem with a supplier, with a market, with one of our own facilities? The earlier we know, the better. I mentioned it before, but I do think, this is also a reason I feel like getting aligned with finance is a huge thing if I'm a supply chain professional in this area, because the reality is decisions on suppliers are huge determiners of how well we're going to handle a disruption, because in many cases, it's not our own operations that impact us. It's our availability of inputs or quality inputs from our suppliers that make the difference. And the reality is, and if I was doing a call with chief procurement officers to say the same thing, the reality is most people in the supplier strategy, the bias is to low cost supply. It has been, in my experience, for the last 30 years. And the reality is, as we know, we've got inflation, we've got other things that are out there. If you can get input cost lower, it reduces the work that you have to do in your own internal cost structure to try to solve that problem. And it limits your requirement to have to take price, which obviously has impact on demand. So I would say, part of the balancing act in this, and why as a supply chain person I need my finance people with me, is to say we've got to counter this balance to just push suppliers for cost reductions. I have seen very specific examples where that has created quality issues. And when times are tough and capacity is an issue or disruptions occur, those suppliers are going to make choices. And if it's the customer who has paid the lowest price, they may not be the first place or the first priority when they have to ration capacity and that type of thing. So thinking long-term and short-term when you're negotiating with suppliers, I think is a huge deal, and we want finance to help us balance that. Um, Again, I think it's both availability and quality. We've seen very specific examples where a supplier said after a quality issue is you pressed us so hard, we actually got rid of some of the people who would have done the kind of work that would have ensured quality. Um, I do think understanding how your suppliers perform is a bigger deal. And then we always advocate, if there's sole source in your network, you really need to understand it. And if you're um, a number of the large customers that I've worked with will basically say there's almost no case for sole source. And if there is a sole source requirement or sole source reality, then there's a lot more work with that sole source supplier because of the risk of dependence on a single source. Um, and I think the other thing to me is how you're engaging with your suppliers in terms of audits, ongoing performance management. The reality is being a bit more intimate with your suppliers is something that pays off. And if you're dealing with international suppliers, there's a cost to going there. But the best of the best have people laying hands on suppliers, being in those plants multiple times a year to understand, do we feel good about what we're seeing here? Does it match what we're being told? Does it match the information that's being shared with us? It just some themes from our research. And, I think for us, the classic example over the last few years is, there was a limit and potentially either an over reliance or lack of understanding of the risk of a just-in-time inventory kind of example. When you close couple a supply chain and there's no slack in it, if something breaks, you just don't have any time to adjust and any slack to be able to pull before the rope pulls taut. So I think what we saw, post 2021 into 2022 was, the desire to say, how do we think about bringing the right level of buffer stock in place or have greater flexibility in our production plants? The truth is, there's been pressure on them as costs have gone up. People are like, why do we have all this extra inventory? It has a cost to it, it has an obsolescence risk. So there's a balance, but our research basically says, how do you do a better job striking that balance? A big thing for us is, what inventory you bring in is a function of the variability in your supply chain. So if you can improve the reliability of your suppliers on an ongoing basis, the amount of inventory that you really need to buffer them can be lower. So there's work to be done there. Mentioned it before around building flexibility. Dual sourcing is the classic one. The reality is you're usually giving up something when you go to that second source, but I just think now is the time, and maybe the work is working with that second source to help them close the gap between the primary supplier and them. Talked about strategic safety stock. That's the kind of thing, where do you put it? There are a few commodities that that companies will say, we're not going to put a safety stock on this item in every one of our facilities, but we may create and make a strategic decision to get a central safety stock or have one facility take on incremental safety stock to give us some more flexibility in the case of disruption. And there's been tremendous work in the last 10 years and accelerated a lot in the last 5 around using the data that exists. Machine learning, ML on this essentially allows us to predict what could happen in the future based on availability of large scale data of what has happened in the past. So machine learning has become much more relevant, and it's technically inside of the AI world. But generative AI now with machine learning is even more powerful. So we're seeing those analytics be put in place, and I would say more and more be democratized, not just for the big companies, not just for the most sophisticated. They're more and more accessible to mid and small size companies. So key message. So on that vein, what are people doing in terms of data and AI? The digital twin concept has been out there for the last, again, 15, 20 years. Most of those early on were looking in the rear view mirror, so not helping you look forward because you were reading the news of what happened, maybe yesterday, but more likely last week, last month. And so it was nice from a historical standpoint. There was some value in it, but not nearly the value that people would like to say. And you started to see those digital twins moving closer to being able to say, here's what's going on today. But the real value, in particular, leveraging more sophisticated analytics like machine learning, is that when you turn those digital twins into something that's predictive, that can start to say, this is going to be a problem. Um, Getting those earlier alerts to say this trend is moving in the wrong direction so that we can get out ahead of it. And most of the folks I know in supply chain don't want to be firefighters. So for me, I think this is a case where if you're in finance, these investment cases or they were pitching proof of concepts or tryouts of different technologies in this space is part of what you're going to hear. And I think having the right process to, lay out an example to find out if there's value in this for your business is an ongoing discussion if you're in finance. So I'll summarize this in a couple headlines, right? I like this idea of quarterly reviews, and I'm going to talk more about how to pitch this. I love the idea of trade-off workshops that may be informed by various scenario analysis. That allows us to understand the P&L impact and the risk trade-off. What risk are we willing to endure? To me, we want leaders to be aware of potential risks. They can say, I see this as possible, but I don't, I'm comfortable taking that risk and making it. In some cases, in a privately held company, people are able to do that. Most public companies now, some risk awareness is something that the board has interest in. Obviously, moving this away from qualitative gut feel to something that is data driven is definitely, to me, part of your journey. If you're there, great. If you're not, this is part of what you want to get to. And then making sure that we have some understanding of resilience metrics connected to our larger scorecards, I think is critical in my mind. It just keeps it appropriately on people's minds. So, to me, and it says CFOs, but I think it's, if you're a finance business leader, whether you're a CFO, you're a VP, whether you're a director, you're a manager, you're working with your cross-functional business partners. These are the kind of questions I want to make sure, you're hearing, you're thinking, and or you're articulating is, if you have an existing planning process, how do you embed some risk elements into that? That's already the place where most of the right people are at the table. And if you put that into your regular business cycle, you have the opportunity to get better. What's on your horizon for this always on? If you can improve, particularly the external awareness. Yes, I think, in a big supply chain, a big owned supply chain, we do want you to have a better understanding of your own operations, but that external, I think, is huge. So I actually see a question out there from Joris. Thank you. And your comment, thank you, is I would have expected another significant disruptor for supply chain resiliency to be global trade, tariff uncertainty, and wars, and it sure is. What has your experience been with this aspect of managing the supply chain, including best lessons learned, best practices, et cetera? I guess I would say, having grown up in commerce in the 90s and the 2000s and the 2010s, when we were moving to a fully global economy, which implied global supply chains, and in truth, more benign, if you look back on it, you could say, hey, that was pretty easy times, right? To now, I think we took a lot of things for granted. Things as simple as the functioning of global transport and global trade, right? In the last few years, we've had big, massive disruptions with the Suez Canal, with the issues with the Houthis and others. We didn't have safe transit. So all of a sudden, ships that would transit from India and coming through the Suez Canal, all of a sudden had to go around the bottom of Africa and add weeks in time and impact that. That just wasn't on our bingo card, right? No different than, in addition to what you have on here, is the impact of climate with the Panama Canal having capacity issues in a few of the last couple of years. And I think, you know, the we took that for granted issue is a big issue, right? The challenge is there's been such investment in a lot of these global sources that this is not an easy thing to unwind. Um, so I think, again, for the folks that I know, first having an ongoing awareness of those decisions. In our example, even something as simple as things coming from China to the US ports on the West Coast and the East Coast have different levels of performance and execution when they deal with disruption. So you have people making different decisions on how much of their cargo they'll split to land in the West Coast, like in LA, versus the East Coast, like Savannah, again, on a more structured basis. So I think our experience in this is be a bit more planful, understand those risks, and I think get more engaged with your business partners, particularly your logistics partners, as well as your suppliers, given the fact that you can't take this for granted. So hopefully, Joris, that helps you a little bit, and happy for you to ask another questions, but thank you for that. So if we kind of press ahead, here's what I pitch to people. And I was one of those people at Coke who, after we had big hurricanes that, knocked plants offline, tornadoes that tore roofs off of plants or whatever, I was the person saying a year later, guys, we've got to invest some time in this, and people were off to other things. So the way I pitch this is, back to your finance role, working with your business partners and your senior leaders, is this should be worth 1% of your management team's time to really think about better ways to protect your business from disruption. And my idea is, if you do the math, if you gave me one afternoon per quarter, and we won't do it on Friday because nobody likes to work much on Friday afternoon, but if you took the last Thursday afternoon in every quarter and said, we're going to devote from 1 to 4, and particularly focused on our understanding of our risk and our ability to respond and react to risk, I think this is a huge muscle for organizations that can take this simple step. And we'll talk about more baby steps than that, but that's kind of the pitch I would make. And for me, what I think is a simple way to think about it is using a structured risk assessment at the beginning of the year, like coming right out of the holidays, just to start it as your business year is getting rolling for most people who run a calendar financial cycle. Revisit your risk foundation in Q1. And the tools that enable you to do that are so easy now, again, because of Gen AI and open source information that's out there. That's the first thing I would do. The reality is, for a high percentage of businesses, weather is a factor. And yes, winter weather is a factor, but for us, water and wind events are much higher in their preponderance of impact on businesses. So I very much advocate for a Q2, whether that's early April, is getting started with a hurricane planning kind of season, right? And now, floods come with hurricanes, as we've seen a lot in the last couple of years, is getting into a seasonal prep, understanding your network, your partners, where there is risk in areas that are more exposed to tornadoes, more exposed to hurricane, more exposed to flood, and building on what was learned last year. I think that's huge. Q3 for me, when you're starting your business planning process, really revisiting where you are with your supplier resilience. What do you know about your suppliers? What are you asking of them? How have they performed? How do you want to do that differently? And can that impact your discussions around how you're allocating capacity as suppliers, which in many cases for most businesses occurs in Q3. And then Q4, use it as a continuous improvement time. For me, not much gets done after Thanksgiving, but if you can get something on the books in the first half of November, you're typically out of hurricane season. You can very quickly capture what you've learned and embed that into what will be your Q1 recycle. So then you've got kind of a virtuous circle going on. So this is something I would say if you're a finance business person, grab your supply chain business partner, including your planning people, and say, how do we pitch this as this low effort for senior leaders, and in many cases, a reasonable effort for the folks who have to do the legwork ahead of these sessions. So I'm a big fan of an FMEA and the formality of business continuity planning. Those are both common practices that there's a lot of open source information on how to do it. But an FMEA can be done across your entire supply chain. Now, I could do one with ChatGPT in a half an hour. I did one for a major supplier for Coke in a half an hour while I was talking to their head of planning. And I sent it to him because he said, I want to take a look at that. And he said, it's 90% accurate. And that was 6 months ago. The tools are better. This is usually trying to get at a lot of open source information. You can choose to do an external view that would get at your suppliers, logistics providers, et cetera, and the markets you do business in. And you can do a separate one using your internal information, but in a very short period of time. And I think having the practice of having your key facilities, either that you own or third-party partners, and understanding the formality of their business continuity plan, I think is huge. Then you've got a risk register that you can maintain, and you can potentially have a place to update, review, and store your continuity plans for those large risks and those key facilities. So that's kind of the Q1 cycle. Q2, very much this weather risk tabletop. I now say you've got to understand 100 and 500-year flood risk for facilities. That information is available publicly, open source for free. You just got to do a little legwork to find it, from a FEMA perspective, but I've used it. Go through a little bit of what will we do if this happens, and particularly for a high probability event. And make sure that the right people understand, and particularly you've got communication protocols in place, because early on communication in those events is critical. And then I'm a big fan of checklists. There have been great books written around the value of having a checklist to help you in advance of a disruption and have it available when something happens. There's a lot of stress and emotion when something happens on short notice, but being able to fall back on a basic readiness plan, I think, is huge. Okay, so this is a big deal, and I saw a chart from National Oceanographic and NOAA, and basically, in particular, the preponderance of water events has been the sum total of the incremental weather events in the last 15 to 20 years. So to me, I really say if you could bet on nothing, water risk is the one that is big. Wind is right behind it. Okay. Q3, very much want you to really make sure you have a good understanding of at least your tier one suppliers. I've talked to a lot of very large companies, and they're still really working on doing a better job at tier two and tier three. But if you don't have tier one in a good place, there's not much point in understanding tier two and tier three. But this is interesting depending on what your leverage is, right? If you're a very powerful customer, your suppliers are going to be very supportive of this. If you're a smaller customer, your suppliers may tell you to, pack sand. That's not a priority for them. But figuring that out, ideally having some joint sessions with your key suppliers about what they're doing in this space. This was a really successful practice that we saw, particularly from big customers like McDonald's and Walmart. But what's your version of that, right? And making sure you understand who's who when times go tough for your key suppliers, and that may go much deeper than you might think. But I honestly believe in this case here, we need to be back in the business of breaking bread and having live discussions with our key partners here, right? If you're engaging with your suppliers, sharing what you're doing, listening what they're doing, there's nothing but good things that are going to come out of this in that Q3 period. And then in Q4, what worked well and what didn't? What did we learn? And how do we think about how that will inform what we will do differently? Again, a pretty expeditious process. Now, I think you can even, again, use an LLM to help you extract this and sustain this, and make sure that you've got this set for your next round in the next year. So this is the idea of being a learning organization. Okay. And again, I think in a lot of cases, the finance folks are the adults in the room. Okay. And so advocating for this is huge. I just a couple simple examples. If I'm running a business continuity plan, I've got a big DC. I want to understand their core functions. I want to understand their technical needs. If tools go down in most facilities now, you're out of business anyway. So understanding utility as well as phone, cell, Wi-Fi in the building, anything that's that's underlying, understanding if you've got third-party labor, any kind of casual labor versus employee-based. I think that's huge. Same thing for transport. We've had facilities that were fine, but everything around them had to cross over a bridge or something like that. We couldn't get carriers in and out. So understanding that systemic access, I think, is important. Understanding what that facility is at risk for. Again, a lot of good FEMA tools that can go down to a zip code in terms of what are the unique risks in this geography, understanding that by site, and then working with your planning and operations teams to say, what is our fallback for each of these facilities? That's what goes into a lot of the scenario planning, business continuity planning. What's the alternate source? What's the impact to capacity, either at a plant, at a warehouse, or with transportation to be able to fall back on that and having that play kind of rerun. I mean, it literally is like practice before the game. FMEA is a tool, failure mode and effects analysis, used a lot, a classic Six Sigma kind of tool. Can be done very qualitatively, can be argued internally, but at the end of it, you've got a high to low risk list to look at and say, do we like the fact that that risk could occur to us? If it occurs, it's pretty severe. Our ability to know about it ahead of time is not great. We got to do something about that, right? And so that's something I advocate in most cases, at least a year, once a year, taking a hard look at this. And then honestly, you're going to come out of this with an action plan for some of these that you want to just take off the table and make sure that's being tracked as well. And I mentioned seasonal weather planning. I do think infrastructure checking is a big deal. A high percentage of these backup power systems don't work that well when they're required. So making sure that an ongoing, preventive maintenance and check of backup power is a big deal. I think increasingly now, loss of internet's a big deal. So do you say at my strategic facilities, I want to have a Starlink as well as a generator so that I can stay in contact with that facility? I think that's a big deal for us. I did mention the scenario planning piece of it and the proactive action. So just just a basic look at that idea. Tier one supplier risk assessment. Again, I think you can do this with suppliers. You can do an external view based on where they physically are. There again is a lot of publicly available information that gets you a head start on this. So this can be done really rapidly. And it gets to a discussion of, this is our low cost supplier, but they've got a lot of risks. Well, maybe the discussion is how do we work with them and say, we love what you're doing, but we need your help to mitigate what we see as real risks. So how are we working on this? So get to an action, right? It may not always be an alternate supplier. We have also seen some places where you had very unique equipment. So it may be less about a whole new supplier, but saying this equipment is kind of the linchpin to this operation. A lot of the other equipment is generic. So do we need incremental tooling that can be potentially placed at a separate location so we don't lose a site for an extended period of time? So I think there's just a number of things in this risk assessment that can be pretty basically done and then become part of an ongoing improvement process here. If you've got it, great. You're moving on to tier 2 and tier 3, which has an incremental degree of difficulty, but at least getting started here. And then, as I said before, kind of this annual improvement loop is huge for me, is how do you, in a very simple way, whether it's a survey, some after action meetings, grab those key learnings based on the events that you saw, some understanding of what the impact was on the severity and duration and how you responded so that you said, how well did we run the game based on our practice? And then how do we think about what we learned from that? We got to update the FMEA. We may need to be more robust in our business continuity planning. There may be more training, either for existing people or new people. And then we roll that forward, before the holiday season hits so we can pull it back out when we get into the new year. So just a very nice improvement cycle. And I think as I get to the close here, for me, you know, it's a small investment in time, right? I said an afternoon, you think about this, we're just asking, for, in some cases, we're getting it down to, 30 minutes a week in terms of getting to this quarter. So this is where the finance people can really help us with that leadership buy-in. In many cases, the finance people control the schedules and the routines. How do we make sure this gets on the agenda? How do we think with kind of a rigorous approach on, what are the to-dos that come out of that, and how do we make sure they get done? And then how do we make sure that we've got resources that people can rely on when it comes to, again, another place where for me, the Gen AI starts to be a big help. So I think starting small is great. If you're ahead of this, that's great. I'll give you some thoughts on more sophisticated, but if you haven't done this, like, hey, I can't get quarterly done. Well, how do we think about it twice a year? If not twice a year, then just once a year, right? There's a case to get started. So this is a way to think about this in terms of where you sit from a maturity standpoint. And this may be a way for you to help think about for your company, what's next for us, right? Are we heavily in this stage one phase where we're not very structured, we're not doing a lot, and we don't capture lessons learned? If that's where you are, that's fine. And how do we find one or two or three key actions that can move us up a level? And so I think this is just a nice way to kind of think of, this may be a 5-year journey, and maybe you should have started it 5 years ago. But if you start now, then this is something that you can basically say, we know we'll be better off next year versus this year. And it's not a huge ask, to go and be an advocate, to say, how do we just take one step up this ladder so we feel more comfortable, that our insurance in this space will pay off for us in the event that things happen that we don't want to happen, but now that we know do happen more particularly. So I would think about this as a multi-year journey for sure, so that your organization doesn't have a shock and saying this is one more thing we've got to do. It's like, hey, what we want to do here is have this proactive time that makes our investment of time in a challenging period a bit more manageable. And then I think I mentioned, risk metrics, and this is also kind of connected to a maturity. But if you're capturing metrics, great. If you're not, like, where do you start, right? How do you get at either its percentage of processes or facilities that have a continuity of plan? Do you know how many single source suppliers you have? Do you understand what your safety stock for us so you have time to outage there? Do you feel comfortable with the contact information you have from your suppliers, and what's the math around that? Those are kind of very basic things that are there. And then I think you can get to more sophisticated metrics in that level too, that really start to look at, do we actually conduct resilience reviews? Do we have a risk profile from all of our tier one suppliers? What percentage of our spend is not only dual source, but not from the same region, right? Two sources in the same geographic area have the same weather risk, even though they're separate companies. And then as you get into more sophisticated, again, we see now some real financial weighting in here in terms of how we're really looking. I mean, I would love to take that FMEA and make it into a probability weighted financial impact for those top 10. So, a lot of companies in their financial management have a risk and opportunity. Maybe some of these risks should be on the risk list that's there. So these are just some examples. You'll get all these slides or have access to them, as well as the recording. So hopefully there are a couple things on here that you say, maybe we should be talking about whether some of these things should be in our current thinking about risk or on the discussion list for something that helps us gain maturity. So hopefully that's helpful for you. And I think this is my last slide, and it's kind of like, if you're great at this, fantastic. If you're not, how do you start now? How do you think about this small investment of time having big value, right? And here we sit. We're in hurricane season right now, so depending on where you are, you're in the soup of it. But whether you start to advocate now, as we are in December, to say, how do we start building the case to start the year off um, with a good kickoff for this? Or how do you start the advocacy in your planning process now to say, can we make a commitment to book these 4 events next year and get started? Okay. Get the calendar time blocked. Start simple with what we think is the largest risk for us that's out there. So start with something that there will be no debate about. And then, just get small wins. Because if we get small wins, people see value in it, they'll commit to it, it'll get baked into what's going on, and people will invest in it there. So this isn't always about, becoming perfect at predicting the future, because there are always going to be things happen that you don't control or can't see. But it's really about saying we're just a little bit better at having the ability to respond when something happens, right? So this idea that I put out there, this framework, kind of gives you a way forward if you don't have one, or a good benchmark. I mean, frankly, you may be listening to this and say, wow, we do all this stuff. You're in good shape. But if you're not, there may be hopefully some ideas in here that help you kind of say, I'm going to be an advocate in my organization for small investments that can have great returns. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So always want to be respectful of everybody's time. So I think we're good on time. If there are a few more questions, happy to speak to them at this point. Alejandro, got your question. Thank you. How do you balance risk assessment between incoming supply chain versus outgoing supply chain, assuming like Coke, a very different landscape from suppliers to customers and consumers? I think you have to have both, practically speaking. I do think it's probably 75-25 on the inbound versus the outbound. If I had to kind of throw a number that's out there, based on my experience, that's been most of the risk that's out there. And then honestly, on the outbound side, it's more about how well your facilities are able to move product forward in the supply chain, either into your distribution network or into your customer's distribution network. So then it's going to be more of a transportation and logistics kind of assessment. Whereas I think upstream is much more of a heavy lift if you're in your manufacturing, contract manufacturing, or your tier one supplier. So hopefully, Alejandro, if you have a different point of view, I'd love to hear it. So happy for folks to throw something in the chat, or happy to take a question. Folks, just come off of mute. And while I'm waiting, Deirdre has a nice question here. Do you have some suggestion on how to broach the financial risk that a supplier may have when you are vetting them? I think if it's a new supplier, again, it goes back to what your, how much do they want to do business with you, or how much do you need to do business with them? At minimum, I would say that we are trying to be more rigorous around our overall risk awareness and risk assessment. And part of understanding supplier performance is about overall wherewithal. And, if they're, and we're talking about somebody here who's privately held, not publicly held, because if they're publicly, you can get a hold of information, but basically say, we need to have a minimum level of understanding of your company's resources to be a going concern. And however you handle that or want to handle that, we need something. And I've seen that work with a lot of privately held companies. So so I think A, we're on the resilience journey. B, we understand you're private, you don't share everything, but we need some evidence, whether it's from your bank or creditors or whatever. I think that's, those are the paths that I would take. Good deal. Commenting on, and thank you, Cynthia, commenting on the tariff environment when planning supply chain risk assessment. It's interesting. We've talked to a lot of industry partners over the course of this year, when this first started to today. And it was an interesting question of how will people handle this, right? And from big to small, at the big companies, people don't want to lose money, but they also don't want to lose business, right? So um, what we definitely saw and still see is, to the extent they could, people push back as hard as they could on their suppliers to say, I have this tariff issue. Um, I need help. Um, I may have to take some of this bite, but I need you to take some of this bite. And so I think the first step for lots of people, right or wrong, was engaging with their suppliers to kind of say, I need you to be able to help me. Also see a tremendous amount of people saying we need to go to school on the tariff codes and make sure we're paying the correct tariff that's out there, so that we've got any slippage in there. And there are companies that specialize in making sure that you're classifying things correctly when you're bringing them in, or that type of thing. So that administrative piece of it has been important. I do think, advocacy from a lobbying standpoint, working with your government, federal, state, and local, and basically saying this is the impact of my business. That's worked for people, whether you do that individually, if you're a big company, or smaller through an industry association. I think that's clearly part of this. But I think as it pertains to risk going forward, now is the question. You have to assume there's some level of durability on this for multiple years, which means you have to decide, can I live like this? Okay. And or do I have the ability to work on alternate sourcing, work on near sourcing for critical commodities to reduce my exposure? And that's the space that I see a lot of people in now, because they say it seems like we're in for a longer haul here. So hopefully that helps, Cynthia.